All right, everyone. I have Kelly Cervantes on today, and she is going to talk to us about epilepsy. She is the chair of the board of directors for CURE Epilepsy, which is a nonprofit leader in epilepsy research for and this last month, November, was Epilepsy Awareness Month. And we're recording this it's December 1st now. I was gonna say at the very end of November, but we just missed it. But it's still such an important topic to talk about. And I'm so excited to have her on and to hear her story, because how she got into this is obviously very, very personal for her. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Elizabeth, thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat all things epilepsy in my family.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's something that's super important that to you, which is what got you into all of this. So I'd love for you to share your story with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So my daughter was diagnosed with epilepsy when she was 7 months old. She had her first seizure, and her early development was a little delayed. She had low muscle tone. She had been diagnosed with hypotonia. We knew that something wasn't quite right, but we had no idea the scope of what we were heading into. We started her on a medication. I knew nothing about epilepsy at the time. I thought that it was easily manageable, that you just threw some drugs at it and it would be fine, and that it was not something that we needed to super worry about. This developmental stuff was really where our concerns lie. We started her on medication and she seemed to be doing a little bit better. She was more responsive. She was making progress in her physical therapy and occupational therapy. And then when she was 9 months old, she was diagnosed with infantile spasms, which is a particularly devastating form of pediatric epilepsy. And I recommend all of your viewers who have young children, specifically under the age of 2, anyone who is expecting, to go online and to look up videos of what infantile spasms look like. It is considered a rare form of epilepsy, but it is far more prevalent than I think people realize. It is such subtle movements. It's a head drop. A lot of times it looks like a startle reflex. The child's legs or arms will grow stiff, and most people just sort of pass it off, but it is 100% an emergency and needs to be treated as such. The longer it goes untreated, the harder it is to get under control and the more damaging it can be. My daughter's case was worst case scenario. A lot of children, if caught early, they get on medications, and the medications are terrifying, but they are so much better than the alternate outcome. My daughter passed away 5 days shy of her 4th birthday. She battled epilepsy for the duration of her life. We never found out the underlying cause of her various illnesses and her epilepsy. Epilepsy is so misunderstood. It is, epilepsy always has another cause, whether it is a brain malformation or a traumatic brain injury or a genetic issue. We believe my daughter's was genetic, but even after every test under the sun, we could never pinpoint what caused it. Whether it was the seizures themselves or some sort of genetic neurodegenerative condition, she just was slipping away from us. And she passed away on October 12th of 2019 and had seizures for the duration of her life. So I don't think that, I can't imagine anything more that just sucks all the control out of you than having to hold your child while they have a seizure and not really being able to do anything about it. I'm a control freak, total type A. And I needed to have something that I could do to help her. And there was just so little that we could do medically, which was where my involvement with Cure Epilepsy came in, because it felt like something I could do where I could make a difference, even if I couldn't in my daughter's day-to-day life.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said, I mean, becoming a parent, you realize how lack of control you have. You could do everything right. We can do all that we can in our power for our children, but there's still things out of our control. There's still things that can happen and to go wrong, and it's scary and it's devastating. And like even listening to your story, it's so emotional because like anytime I hear a story of like child loss or infant loss, it's just like, wow, these parents are so strong. Like, I don't know how you did it.
I don't know either,
Yeah.
except for when it's your child, you'll do anything for them, right? So it's, you know, people have often told me, you know, how strong I am, but when you're in the moment, you're just pushing forward day to day. Um, it's actually interesting. We're recording this podcast today, and last night, so Cure, in February of 2018, Cure Epilepsy came. I invited them into our home to film a day in the life of living with my daughter and caring for my daughter. And we had this footage forever. We didn't really know what to do with it. We were going to turn it into some sort of video podcast episode for Cure's podcast Seizing Life. We weren't sure. And then Adelaide's condition nosedived, and then she passed away. And then I just couldn't watch the footage. And so it's been now 4 years since we recorded this, but we're releasing it to the public on Monday. What is that? This upcoming Monday, December 5th, 4th.
Something like that.
And I watched the final cut last night. And it was really, really difficult to watch. But the thing that struck me the most was how this was our normal. How seizures and meds 5 times a day and the therapies and all of these things, it became our normal. It became my son's normal. My son is now 10. He was 6 when my daughter passed away. He's 5 in the, he was 7 when she passed away. He's 5 in the video. How normal it was for him. And I look back on it now, and at the time it was so normal. It was what we needed to do. It was how we got through a day. Yes, I was strong, I guess, but you don't, when you're in it, you're not thinking about that. And now I watch this video and I look back on it, and I realize how screwed up it is, how unbelievably messed up this life was, how not normal it was, and how tragic it was. And all that said, my daughter was amazing. She was a light. She was incredible. She would look at you with this like twinkle in her eye. She lost the ability to smile several years before she passed away, but she could still look at you, and she just stole your heart. She was feisty as all get out. My son insisted on cuddling with her every morning, and she would swat at him when he cuddled her too hard. She made very clear what she wanted and what she didn't, even though she was nonverbal. And, you know, and there is a magic to that I think people will get to see in this video. There are pieces of our family that were just so very normal. The unconditional love and the care and the play. But this epilepsy shadow was just cast so large and so heavy over our family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, at the beginning, when you said it's misunderstood, I mean, I'm one of those people who know nothing about epilepsy, and you don't really think of it as something that's could be potentially fatal.
No. I mean, like I said, I knew nothing about epilepsy when we started. I certainly didn't know that 1 in 26 people will be diagnosed with epilepsy in their lifetime. I had no idea that 3.4 million Americans had epilepsy. I didn't know that it was only 1/3 of the people who are diagnosed will ever get seizure control. So there is this large swath of
Yeah.
people who are just going to have seizures for the rest of their life, and there's no treatment out there that is going to be able to help them. And in my daughter, it was incredibly debilitating, disabling. It was fatal. But the scope of how epilepsy can affect someone's life. So there's my daughter on one end of the spectrum, but then you could be a fully functioning, able-bodied adult like you or I, and have seizures, but it still is going to have this drastic effect on your life. The anxiety of when the next seizure is going to happen. Often if you have regular seizures, you're not able to have a driver's license, and just how debilitating that can be in someone's life, how it affects your work, how it affects your ability to have a romantic relationship. So it has these drastic effects on individuals' lives, but it also comes with such stigma, and people don't talk about it because it's scary. Seizures are scary. They look scary. And there's all different kinds of seizures and all different kinds of epilepsy. It's just, there's a saying, you meet someone with epilepsy and you've met one person with epilepsy.
Mm.
It looks so different. It affects people so differently. And so I think it makes it very difficult to communicate about. It makes it very difficult for people to understand how serious a condition it can be. And because of that, we end up with significantly less resources, significantly less money for research, than a lot of other neurological diseases, even though it is the third most common neurological disease that can afflict humans.
Hmm.
And so and that was sort of my impetus for becoming involved with Cure Epilepsy, because here was an organization that was raising money for research. And for me, there is so much hope in research. We quickly realized that the research that was occurring was probably not going to benefit our daughter, that science wasn't going to catch up to her, but that doesn't mean that science can't catch up to the next Adelaide, to the next person who is diagnosed. And so Cure is regularly funding incredible research from all over the world. The research that they are funding is patient focused. Just as I was coming into the Cure Epilepsy organization, they were wrapping up this multi-year initiative with scientific centers all over the world studying infantile spasms. And out of that research, it looks like we may have another possible new treatment for infantile spasms. We haven't had a new treatment for IS in decades. And because of Cure Epilepsy's research, there might be a new treatment on the horizon. And there's just so much hope for me in that years from now, science moves ludicrously slow, so, 5 years from now, or whenever this drug actually hits the market, that maybe there's a family that doesn't have to have the same outcome that we did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It can be super frustrating waiting for like research and stuff to come out, especially when you're not sure what caused it. And then the lack of funding when it is so common. I had no idea how common it was as well. And so for something to be that prevalent in our society and have not that many answers can be extremely frustrating. But that's why I love having these conversations as well, because like I said, I knew nothing about it before talking to you. I didn't know how prevalent it was, that it could be fatal, any of that, or even that there was different kinds, right? And so it's important to spread this message and for people listening as well, because the more people know about it, the more we can demand change and research and look into it. And like you said at the beginning, like watch an infant, what's it called?
Infantile spasms.
An infantile spasm, which this next week is Infantile Spasm Awareness Week. And I feel like that just has to be scary though, too. Like I can't, like as a parent, like watching your child go through that
It's horrendous. I like, there's no, and it doesn't ever get easier. You never sit there and are like, oh, well, they're having another seizure and it's spot. Like, it's never okay. It's never, ever okay, but it's happening every day all over. And, and people aren't talking about it. It's unfortunate because I feel like the people who are talking about it, they're the bees. They're the worst case scenarios. They're the parents who have the children who have the worst disabilities, who are affected the greatest. But it's also easy to disregard is the wrong word, but to sort of set aside and be like, that's an extreme situation. That's not going to happen to me. For what it's worth, I didn't think it was going to happen to me either. It was something that happened to other people, and it wasn't going to happen to one of my children. I'm perfectly healthy. My husband is healthy. But it was. But the thing is that it can have epilepsy is non-discriminatory. It doesn't care how old you are. It doesn't care your gender. It doesn't care your ethnicity. It doesn't care about your skin color. It is entirely non-discriminatory. We're seeing it increasing cases in the older generations as people age and get older. In the elderly, we're seeing increased cases. Traumatic brain injuries, veterans coming back from overseas, especially with IUDs. We're seeing increased cases, and the Department of Defense actually gave Cure Epilepsy a significant grant to try and study post-traumatic epilepsy in traumatic brain injuries, because we're seeing this so much in our troops who are coming home. So it has such a wide ranging effect on people, which is why we have to talk about it. Cure Epilepsy has recently had a campaign that was talk about it, #SayEpilepsy, trying to motivate people to share their story, to share their personal epilepsy stories, how epilepsy has affected them. Because I interviewed on my podcast recently a man who had epilepsy for 12 years and didn't realize that's what it was. Wow. He thought he had a seizure disorder. That's what the VA had told him, that he had a seizure disorder. And so he was having a hard time finding community. He couldn't research it, but really seizure disorders are epilepsy. They are the exact same thing. And so he has epilepsy this entire time, but he doesn't have the words, the vocabulary to be able to understand his own condition. So it's so important that we do talk about this, that we do use the right vocabulary, and that we do raise this awareness so that we can get more money for research, so that we can make a difference, so that other families, because it does affect the entire family. If a mother has epilepsy, or a woman, it affects her ability to potentially have a child of her own. The medications can affect her pregnancy. If she has a kind of seizure where she can fall, all of these things that have to be taken into consideration, that, you're just not thinking about. On an average day, there are certain medications that can entirely prevent a woman from having a baby. So it's just so freaking complicated and complex. And I know that's why it makes it so difficult for people to wrap their brains around. But we have to try. And I feel so fortunate in a very backwards way that my family was in a position where we could raise awareness. My husband, the same week that my daughter was diagnosed with epilepsy, my husband found out that he had landed the role of Hamilton in the Chicago production.
Oh, amazing.
So we, actually, when my daughter was diagnosed with infantile spasms, I was in Chicago trying to find a home for our family, and had to rush home from Chicago, go directly to the hospital. Hamilton and epilepsy have been intertwined in our lives. The week that my daughter passed away, my husband found out that he was going to take over as Hamilton on Broadway. We were given this opportunity and this platform for whatever reason. People care what my husband and my family have to say. And if that can help people pique interest into this condition, then by all means, let's raise their interest and raise their awareness, and give people just one more reason to care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And one question I should have asked at the beginning, and I had it in my mind, but then just got completely caught up in everything. What is epilepsy exactly? Like, we didn't define it exactly, because you're saying like
Yes.
this veteran said that he had just seizures. And I know kids can sometimes get febrile seizures. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Febrile?
Yep. Yeah.
Like if their fever's too high or something like that. So what makes, I know epilepsy is this broad umbrella with so many things that we don't know, but how do you kind of define epilepsy?
Absolutely. So it is, I think it's best described as like an electrical storm in the brain. And it is, so your brain has all of these electrical pathways, and for whatever reason, they misfire. And so epilepsy is diagnosed when someone has two or more seizures that are unexplained. So a child can have febrile seizures and not be diagnosed with epilepsy if they only have the seizures when they have a fever. However, a child who has frequent febrile seizures is going to be more prone to develop epilepsy later in life. A brain that has the ability to seize is going to be more likely to continue to try and seize, which is why the medications become so frustrating, because our brains are wild, and they will try and find a way around the medications and the treatments so that they can continue to seize. So epilepsy is diagnosed through an EEG, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the word that EEG stands for, but the patient gets a bunch of leads placed all over their head, and it measures brain waves in a pattern that I tried for years to try and understand and deduct on my own, but never quite could understand. But it can measure the electrical activity, and different spike and wave patterns will show up, and that will allow a doctor to diagnose epilepsy. That said, sometimes the electrical activity can be happening so deep within the brain that it won't even show up on an EEG. Further complicating things, but more often than not, seizures can be seen on an EEG. And there are, I want to emphasize that there are some amazing treatments. We have come so far with brain surgery these days that if they can figure out exactly where in the brain the seizures are coming from, that they can go in with lasers, minimally invasive surgery, and, go in with a laser and remove that part of the brain that is seizing, as long as it's not in a part that is going to drastically affect someone's everyday life. It used to be that, they had to like remove pieces of the skull and go in, and this was major surgery. And technology has advanced so much that it's now you have brain surgery and you can go home the next day. It's wild. It's wild what we can do.
Yeah. It's wild that the word minimally invasive and brain surgery go together.
I know.
They don't seem like they're in the same category.
No, they don't. They don't. And and sometimes the brain surgery works and sometimes it doesn't. The number of people I've spoken to who have had brain surgery and then the seizures come back, it's a beast, and we don't understand it. No doctor can fully explain why seizures happen or where they come from. But they do. And people need to be aware. They need to know what to look for. Some seizures are just, they look like someone is staring off into space. And these are more common in children. They're called absent seizures. And it's something parents should be on the lookout for. If, your child is often accused of daydreaming in class, or they're not paying attention, it's the possibility that it could be an absent seizure, and they will, sometimes it can take years for it to be diagnosed, because it's just thought that the child isn't paying attention. but really they're having a seizure.
Wow.
So it's, the tonic-clonic, the movie style seizure that we're used to seeing where someone is
Right.
shaking. My daughter's seizures, she would just sort of stiffen up and then relax. And then they would come in clusters. And then absence. I mean, they can look so different.
Mm-hmm. Right. Again, it's that misunderstanding of what epilepsy and seizures are, because you see the Hollywood version, or, one person who had the traditional, not even traditional, but what we normally view as a seizure.
Sure.
Because we're told like it could be side effects for a lot of different things, and it's usually not a big deal. Like even with vaccines or whatever, it's like, okay, this could potentially happen, but it's not epilepsy. It's just like a reaction, or it's just this thing, or with a high fever, it could be a side effect, and then it's done. It doesn't like,
and that's totally possible. That's 100%.
Right.
You can have one seizure and then never have another one ever again, and it is a freak thing. Or you can have devastating seizures multiple times a day. I mean, even once a month, even having a seizure 3 times a year. If you imagine as an adult, and you have a seizure at work, I spoke to a woman who was a teacher, and the school let her go because they felt like she was a liability if she had a seizure in the classroom.
Or when you're driving,
the ability to drive.
Yeah.
So it's, again, worst case scenario, my daughter had multiple seizures a day, but it doesn't matter. As long as someone is having, multiple seizures in a year in their life, it's going to impact their quality of life. And, and that's where my continued fight for research and for cures comes in, because it is, it's life-changing for the person, for the family, for everyone who loves them. And there has to be better ways to treat this. There has to be better understanding. It's just the status quo is not acceptable.
Well, at the beginning, you were saying with your daughter, the medications can be scary, but it was a better alternative to her not being on them. What did those medications look like, and what made them, I guess, scary?
Yeah, well, so there's one medication specifically for infantile spasms that can cause peripheral vision loss. There is another one that is a heavy duty steroid, like big dog steroid. She puffed up big time, moon face, steroid moon face. She got super swollen, completely unrecognizable to the child that she was a month prior. She was uncomfortable. She was cranky. She was screaming. As long as she was awake, she was screaming. She was on another medication that she had a reaction to. Her body, this particular type of drug, we quickly learned, was not a viable solution for her. It stopped her breathing.
Oh my gosh.
And she was on oxygen for the last chunk of her life, but the number of times I had to resuscitate her, and then we found out that it was actually just this medication. Now, that medication, was not okay, but the medications for infantile spasms, they were horrible, but they were temporary. And having your child alive is much better than having them, I will take a living child over peripheral vision loss any day. Short term, 2 months of living hell of your child screaming and uncomfortable is worth it to have them potentially seizure free and alive and developmentally making progress. And there are good outcomes from these drugs. There are, like I say, my family, my daughter, we are worst case scenario. Unfortunately, someone has to be that worst case, right? But there are families out there who their children take these medications and it's horrible, and it is the worst several months of their lives getting through these medications, but then their kids are okay, usually because they caught it early enough, or there aren't other underlying conditions. And their kids can go on to lead normal, healthy lives, but people have to know what to look for. They have to know that these things exist.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it's something that you normally don't find out about until you're in it,
Hmm.
until you are forced to. And it's nice to have some education and knowledge so that you know what to look out for. And I don't know if with epilepsy, is there any sort of early intervention? Like if it's caught earlier, I mean, if you know what you're looking out for, could that make a difference or not
Yeah,
really?
absolutely. I mean, again, it depends on the kind of epilepsy that you're dealing with. But 100%, the longer a brain is actively having seizures, the harder it is to get those seizures controlled. It's been explained to me like if you, it's like you walk a path over and over and over again, and you have treads in that path, and so the brain will just continue to go down those treads. It'll continue to go down that path. And that's the case when it is having seizures. So the seizures sort of create this path in the brain, and then the brain is just more likely to continue to have seizures. But if you can block off that path, then it will ideally find newer, healthier ways to process. And ideally, the sooner you can stop those seizures, the less likely they are to continue. It's just for 1/3 of people, not always possible.
Hmm. Yeah. Uh, Earlier when I said you're so strong, and then you said you didn't feel like it, and people would say that to you, uh, I would love some advice for anyone listening who knows a parent who's dealing with a child who is in any sort of um, disability or life-threatening situation or diagnosis. Because I'm sure that they hear that all the time, right? You're so strong, and I'm sure you're like, cool. Like I wish I didn't have to be.
Yeah.
And and maybe that wasn't like the right word to say, but like what are encouraging words to say? Like how could people show up for you in these situations, or what is something that is encouraging for you to hear?
um, One of the best ways that people could show up for me, for our family, was by getting to know Adelaide, by not being afraid of her and all of the equipment that came with her, um, learning different ways to help me make her more comfortable so that I could go to someone's house. It was very difficult for me to leave our home. Um, but some of my best friends figured out different ways to make us comfortable so that they could have us in their homes. Helping with my son was a huge help. Adelaide would go into the hospital for a week at a time, about once a month, every other month. And I
Mm.
needed significant help for my son because my husband worked nights. He was at the theater every night, 6 nights a week. And um, so I needed help there, knowing that I had a phone list of mothers who could pick my son up from school or take him to piano or baseball or whatever was hugely helpful. Um, Knowing that he had that support. Uh, and then just being an ear to listen. I think that just sitting with someone and meeting them where they are is so underestimated, that you don't always have to say anything, that you just have to be there, just acknowledge that it sucks. Um, but also acknowledge how amazing their child is, and that at the end of the day, every parent just wants their kid to be happy. And even if they are nonverbal, even if they are non-mobile, that doesn't make their child less than. It doesn't mean that they don't still want their child to have friends and to be happy. And finding ways to be there in that regard, to be a friend to their child. Perhaps your children can be friends with their child, and teaching your children about disability and that it's not something to fear, that disability is just part of life, that it's, some people have disabilities and some people don't, and some people have blue eyes and some people have brown. And it is just another kind of person, that there is nothing wrong with it, that there is nothing to be ashamed of, and that it can be just as beautiful as being able-bodied. And I think that there's just so much that we can do in raising our children to be empathetic. And so there's the ways that we can help the family immediately through their other children, through being an ear, through accommodating them and their families' needs. But there's also these ways that we can help them in a grander scheme by just educating and being empathetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really important. And I think it's so important to have those conversations with your child, because other parents that I have talked to have always said that they wish that if kids were curious about their child because they had an oxygen tank or something on, that they'd just come over and be like, hey, why do you have this? And just like ask and be curious and talk to them instead of like pointing and whispering or whatever. Just be like, hey, why don't you go ask and see? And it seems like that's what most moms would prefer or be open to having their kids, so that they can talk to them and get to know them and learn about them in that moment.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite moments with Adelaide, once a year, we would bring her into my son's classroom and we would talk about epilepsy with all the kids in his class. And I mean, this is kindergarten, first grade, second grade. She passed away when he was in second grade. So, but we would bring her in with all of her equipment and we'd talk about epilepsy. We'd talk about all of her equipment. We'd talk about, just because she couldn't talk didn't mean that she couldn't communicate. We talked about disabilities and all the different kinds of disabilities and what disability could look like. And that even if someone has a disability or they can't talk or they walk different, that they still want friends and they still want, kids to be nice to them. And it never failed. After we would go in and have that talk, I would bring Adelaide with me to pick Jackson up from school over the course of the next year. And his classmates would all come out and they would say hi to her and ask to hold her hand and ask how she was doing that day. And they would talk to her and they understood that she wasn't going to respond to them. They understood that she was different, but they weren't scared and they included her. And whether it made an impact on Adelaide or not, sometimes I think she just preferred to be left alone, suck her thumb. But it made a huge impact on me to see them include her and acknowledge her and not ignore her. And I know it made a huge impact on my son. His sister was not someone that he needed to be embarrassed about or ashamed of. He was so proud of her and he loved showing her off. And there's something magical about children because they can look at people and just see the person that's in front of them. Their vision isn't clouded by expectations or what ifs or what was's. They don't get lost in this world of the had-beens, the what could have beens. They get to live in the present and just see a person for who they are. And it's a really magical thing to be able to witness and acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so cute that your son would just be proud of her and showing her off. And that's so sweet. Yeah. How did you deal, I guess, with her passing with your son?
He closed off from us. He doesn't, even to this day, he won't talk about her passing with us. He, in advance, so we knew that she was dying. We had hospice services in our home. We made the choice to let her go. She was suffering significantly. She was on so many medications, and we had to make the choice that her quality of life was not, nor ever going to be what it could be. Her brain was dying. And so we made the choice to let her go, and we brought in hospice services. And I mean, it's but what I am grateful for, I think that hospice has, people have such a negative view of hospice, or they don't understand it, or they think that it's a place. And having hospice in our home was the greatest gift that we had, because they took over a lot of caring for Adelaide. And I had an incredible home nurse. Oh my God. She was like my little sister, and we still keep in touch. And Adelaide just freaking adored her. So I did have help, but when hospice came in, they took whatever was left on my plate off, and I just got to be Adelaide's mother. But that also meant that I got to be Jackson's mom again too. And there was a good chunk of time where my ability to be his mother was significantly compromised. And so I got to be there and explain to him. Hospice brought in a social worker to work with him and to help him understand. He had been in therapy already for years, just because he'd had life around Adelaide was traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
So he had been in therapy, but now we had someone in our home who could help and someone he could talk to. And so I feel like we prepared him as best that we could. But I think the biggest impact for him was not necessarily losing his sister, because the really hard thing for me to come to terms with is that his life was actually better without her in some ways. And I know that sounds so harsh. I know that sounds awful, but he got his parents back. He got undivided attention. The trauma and the stress in our house was gone in many ways. And so his life improved in so many ways without her. But I was very depressed, obviously losing a child. And he has always sort of felt like a caregiver. That was how we showed Adelaide that we loved her, was through caring for her. And so he knew how to administer her meds. He knew how to, not that I really let him, he would help me, right? He knew about her feeding tube and how to turn it off. He knew what her seizures looked like, and he would let me know when she was having one. He, 4, 5, 6 years old, and he was a caregiver. And so he took on that role for me when I was in the darkest days of my grief, and he wanted to be my caregiver. And at the time, I felt really guilty about that was not the position that my son should be in, that I should be there for him, and that he didn't need to be there for me. But now that I have time and space, I understand that was one of the ways that he was able to grieve, and that he was able to process his emotions, because that's how he had always processed his emotions around his sister, was through caring for her. And so that was one of the ways that he processed his grief, was through caring for me. And I no longer see that as a faulty parenting on my part and something that I need to feel guilty about, but really this beautiful lesson and experience that I hope will serve him as he gets older and continues to be an empathetic human who loves and cares for people. It's been a struggle. He's still in therapy. He has pretty intense anxiety. Siblings of children with disabilities and medical complexities do not come out of childhood unscathed. They are all going to be affected. Ideally, there's going to be ways that it positively impacts them 100%. They're going to be empathetic. They are going to be understanding. They are going to be patient. They come out with a set of life skills that most adults dream of. But I think that there is a inclination in our society to look at the siblings and and cover up their trauma and the effect that it has on them. And I think that that's a disservice to them. They are negatively impacted. And there's nothing that can be done. That's nobody's fault.
Mm-hmm.
But to not acknowledge it and to not get them the help and that they need and the tools so that they can process that, is denying them. And so that's something that I've tried to be very aware of, is making sure that he has those tools and not trying to cover up his trauma and his anxiety by saying, well, look what a wonderful kid he is because he had such a special sister. He is an incredible kid because in large part because he did have an amazing sister. And he also is an incredible kid who has anxiety and will be forever impacted by the life we led with his sister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I do feel like you hear so much about the person going through it, and then you talk to the parents, but the siblings are often kind of forgotten about, or it's like, oh, well, he's so young, he'll forget about it as he gets older or whatever. But it's like, no, those childhood traumas are real. And I can't imagine, like you said, you had to lean on friends because you were in the hospital with her for a week at a time, and you had to have community support through this and divided attention. So it has to impact them, like you were saying. And that's amazing though, that you put him in therapy and recognize that, and that he continues, because you can't imagine what they're going through as well.
No, and they're kids, right? They don't want to talk about it with their parents. They're the last people they want to talk about it with.
How old's your son now?
He's 10 now, and he loves therapy. Like, he loves it. He loves having his time where he just gets to talk about whatever he wants to talk about with this person who's listening. And yeah, we used to call it his feelings doctor, and now he understands that it's therapy, and he's not embarrassed, or he's like, no, I need this. I want this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, good for you, dude.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And breaking that stigma that it's somehow bad or anything like that. Before we wrap up, if I just wanted to open it up to see if there's anything else about CURE that you wanted to share, and then also where people could get in touch or find or follow you or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone wants more information about Cure Epilepsy, you want to learn more about epilepsy, cureepilepsy.org is the website. And you can get all sorts of information. If you feel compelled to donate, by all means, 'tis the season. And you can find the podcast that I host called Seizing Life, which covers all aspects of epilepsy and the different people that it affects. And we interview scientists, researchers, caregivers, patients. And then you can find me. I'm probably most active on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm at KellyGC411. And then I have my blog that I write once a week. My earlier posts are all about Adelaide and parenting a medically complex child, epilepsy, all of those things. It is now significantly more about my grief journey after losing her. And we're actually in the process of adopting. And so it has a bit to do about adoption as well, and this 3-year-old whirlwind that has entered our home and is amazing. And but all the complex emotions that come along with that. And then I actually have my debut book is coming out in November of 2023. It's called Normal Broken. And it is sort of my grief journey after losing Adelaide. And it's meant to sort of be a companion for other people who've experienced loss, not just child loss, be it spouse or sibling or parent. But, hopefully people can take bits and tips from my story and feel like they have someone who's walking this very non-linear, screwed up grief path with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amazing. And I'll have all the links in the show notes. I was taking some notes, and I'll get all the links from you so people know where to connect with you, where they can donate to Cure, and then where they can follow your journey as well. I was looking at your Instagram before this, and I saw something about adoption on there. I was like, wait, are they adopted?
Yeah.
So that's super.
Yeah.
That's cool.
She is something else. She's amazing. She brought joy and laughter back into our home. And I'm eternally grateful for the opportunity to love her.
That's amazing. Awesome. Well, like I said, I'll include all that in the show notes. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story and being so open with us and coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight and an honor. Thank you.